vCenter Server, otherwise known as Virtual Center Server. Virtual Center is one of the most important applications in the VMware infrastructure suite, if not the most important. It is literally the backbone of the infrastructure. It is what makes the enterprise. And when I say it is what makes the enterprise, what I mean is Virtual Center is the tool or is the application that allows multiple ESX servers to be aware of each other. And once these servers are aware of each other, then it unlocks enterprise class capabilities like vMotion, like high availability, like distributed resource scheduler, like update manager, and many, many more. Now for these features to function, all the ESX servers need to know of the other servers' existence, and they need to be grouped together and configured in such a way that they could take advantage of these features. Now you can think of Virtual Center as that umbrella that holds underneath it all these pieces and components and makes them aware of each other and connects them to one another and allows the VMware infrastructure to crawl out and reach out to an enterprise level. And it acts as a proxy and allows you to manage all the ESX servers in your enterprise and all the virtual machines that are running on these ESX hosts. So instead of logging in to every ESX host and managing it and all of the virtual machines that are on it, you log into the single centralized tool and you manage all of your ESX servers, you manage all of your virtual machines. In addition, you unlock enterprise class features. Virtual Center is just literally amazing, or shall we say virtually amazing. So here are some features that are unlocked with the use of Virtual Center. Now, multiple ESX server management. You can group multiple ESX servers under one umbrella, Virtual Center, and manage them all from the same place. VM management, which means you can manage all of your VMs from Virtual Center. Update manager allows you to update, patch management, all of your ESX servers and the virtual machines. We're going to get into that. It's a really cool tool. You can think of it as sort of like Windows Update, even though I know VMware doesn't like us to refer to anything to do with Microsoft, but this is not a VMware sponsored CBT, so I can say whatever I want. So Update Manager, you can think of Update Manager as Windows Update, but for ESX. Then you have Converter Enterprise. And Converter Enterprise, what it is, it used to be called P2V Assistant. What it does is it converts physical machines to virtual machines. It also has the capabilities of converting different virtual machine types into ESX virtual machines. And we'll get into Converter in a little bit. Converter is one of those tools that when I started using it, I was like, wow, you can really do that. It's like when I started using VMware ESX and I could do vMotion, I was like in awe. And then I started using P2V and I'm like, okay, this is way too cool. And then every feature that I used of the VMware infrastructure just made me say, man, where was this technology all along? And I just fell in love with this. There's a lot of new features that they introduced that are really cool, like storage vMotion. Well, after a while, vMotion became old. I wasn't impressed with it. But then came along storage vMotion where you can move the files, and I'm like, wow, that's cool. And then there was Site Recovery Manager. It just felt like every release that VMware introduced just became a hit. It's like a blockbuster hit in a movie or something. So let's continue on here. Now templates. Templates are really cool, and we'll talk about them in a second, and they're made available via Virtual Center. What templates are basically gold builds of your virtual machine. So you create a virtual machine, you update it, you patch it, you configure it the way you want, and then you make a template out of it so that you can revert back to this template for quick deployment. Really cool. Also gives you access control, which means you can have role-based access to Virtual Center so that if you want certain users in your organization to log into Virtual Center and perform specific tasks but not other tasks, you can customize access control and security. Really cool, and we'll get into that in a bit here. Again, VMware Update Manager, which provides for an automated patch management solution. VMware Converter Enterprise for Virtual Center, which basically integrated the P2V inside of a Virtual Center and allows you to do physical to virtual or virtual to virtual on the fly. Guided Consolidation is a really cool tool, and you can think of Guided Consolidation as sort of an entry-level tool that is being offered to users so they can see how capacity planning can be done. What Guided Consolidation does is it will run in your enterprise and then it will query physical servers it will query for their performance metrics, and then it will tell you if they are good candidates for virtualization or not. Now with guided consolidation, because I'm telling you it's an entry-level tool, what VMware has done is you can only use it against Windows machine. Now if you wanted the full-blown capacity planner tool, which can be used against Unix, Linux, any type of physical machine basically in your environment, in order to get performance metrics and recommendations as to if these physical servers are virtualization candidates or not, then that would become a separate product. This is just being offered here as an entry level to show you the capabilities and what you can do with things like, or tools like, guided consolidation and capacity planner. Alright, now let's take a quick look at the pieces and the components that make up Virtual Center Server. Let's take a look under the hood for a little bit and take a look at how many different components are bridged together to create Virtual Center and all of the things that we see. So one of the main interfaces, if we want to call it, is Core Services. Now Core Services is what provides you the basic functionality of Virtual Center Server. It is literally the heart of the application. It gives you stuff like VM provisioning, task scheduler, events logging, and so on and so forth. Then you have the distributed services. Now this part of Virtual Center Server is responsible for enterprise features like vMotion, high availability, and DRS. Then you have the additional services. Now this portion, or this piece or side of Virtual Center, is what allows for integration of plugins that are third-party, or not third-party plugins, but plugins that can be installed manually outside of the Virtual Center installation. So let's say you've installed Virtual Center today. Your available plugins are VMware Converter Enterprise and Update Manager. 2 months from now, VMware comes out with another plugin for Virtual Center and gives you this plugin as a standalone installation. You can come on the Virtual Center Server, you can install this component, and this would be the interface on Virtual Center Server that takes care of that. This is the piece that takes care of that. Then you have the database interface. Now the database interface, as its name implies, allows for database connectivity for Virtual Center, extends Virtual Center in order to create a repository for it, for all its data, etc., etc. Now ESX host management, again, this is exactly what the name implies. This service, or this interface from Virtual Center, is what connects to the ESX hosts and manages them. Now Active Directory integration or interface is what we're going to be talking about during the course of this module, is what allows Virtual Center to integrate with Active Directory and make the users and groups that are available in your Active Directory domain available through Virtual Center, so you'll be able to control access to Virtual Center through Active Directory users and groups, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now the VI API is simply a software development kit that's available for developers that allows them to write custom applications that can plug into Virtual Center. So this was a brief under the hood look at the different components and pieces that make up the Virtual Center Server. Now before we install Virtual Center, let's take a look at some of the pre-installation steps that we need to do. Now as you know, or as you may not know, a Virtual Center requires a database as a repository for its data. Now this database can be either Microsoft SQL Server 2005 Express, which is a small version of Microsoft SQL Server. Typically this is used for demo purposes only, which is what we're going to be using for the purposes of this demonstration. However, for your enterprise, I strongly recommend that you use a full-blown SQL Server or a full-blown Oracle Server, and not the small version of SQL, unless you're using it for very, very small environments that you know aren't going to be growing anytime soon. If you have maybe a small test dev of 2 to 3 servers, then you're fine creating Microsoft SQL Server 2005 Express. But anything above that, anything that you want to be able to build in order to scale, you want to use a real database server. And again, because these are virtual machines, and I can guarantee you, as soon as you have your virtual infrastructure in place, if you have planned this virtual infrastructure to grow to 50 virtual machines, I can guarantee you it will double in size. Because as soon as people start getting used to the idea of how easy it is to provision these virtual machines, how easy it is when they request from you that they require a machine for test, for development, for production, and you're provisioning these on the fly, and once they start to know how powerful this is and all the features and capabilities that are available, your environment is going to double. It's going to grow. So don't plan on having a small environment and say to yourself, this will never grow. I guarantee this will grow. So these are the versions that the database for Virtual Center supports. You have Oracle, you have Microsoft SQL Server 2000, 2005, MSDE, etc., etc. Now, prior to the installation of Virtual Center 2.5, you should know what type of database you want to use. Now, if you've used Microsoft SQL, for example, you want to make sure that an ODBC, or data source connection, exists from the server on which you will install Virtual Center to the database server and to the actual database where you are going to configure Virtual Center to point to. So you want to make sure your database is ready, it's created and ready, and your data source is configured to point to this new database. Now on this slide, we're showing you the minimum hardware requirements and software requirements that you need to run Virtual Center Server. Now, some of the Virtual Center Server pre-installation requirements include Virtual Center needs to be part of a domain specifically so that we can use Active Directory authentication in order to log on to Virtual Center and provide that role-based access that we need so that not everybody, or that we don't have to create a separate directory for Virtual Center and then create usernames and password for that. So it leverages Active Directory in order to allow for the usernames and passwords to be managed from there. You also need to assign a static IP address for Virtual Center Server and a host name. Obviously, now these are best practices for any type of server, but these are also requirements for vCenter Server as a pre-installation checkmark. We also need to create the backend database. Now, whatever database you've chosen, whether that's a Microsoft Express, SQL, Oracle, or whether that's an IBM DB2, depending on what you've done. And then you have to determine licensing options, which we're also going to cover in the next slides here. One of the most common questions that I'm asked inside of any deployment that we've done, or any deployment that we've been hired as a consulting firm to consult on, the question comes up whether or not we should virtualize Virtual Center. And my question is always, well, why not? I mean, we are building a virtual infrastructure. The whole point here is to minimize the amount of physical servers that you have. So you go and take the piece that is the central management repository or console for the virtual infrastructure in general, and you're going to make it a physical box. And that physical box is going to consume, again, 10% of these resources that are available on that box. So it's kind of like you're defeating the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish here. A virtual environment should not have to have any kind of physical server components, because the main thing we're trying to virtualize here are servers. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of having a physical versus virtual server? First of all, yes, it is supported by VMware. Virtual Center can be a virtual server, and it can participate in HA, it can participate in DRS, it can be vMotion, it can be backed up. So you have all these advantages to your Virtual Center server that can make sure its uptime is increased. On the contrary, when you have it as a physical server, then it's prone to hardware failure. If any of the hardware components on that physical server fails, then Virtual Center is going to fail. Now, one of the advantages that you'll always hear as an advantage to having it as physical server is, well, if vSphere goes down, then it's not affected. Well, my question is, if vSphere goes down, what do you need your Virtual Center for? Now, the only thing that you need to do in virtual is make sure that you control or have redundant servers, and that can come in the form of a heartbeat service or plugin that we'll talk about later on in this training course. Or you can cluster it, or have us create another clone VM and shut it down. I mean, there's all sorts of ways of creating redundancy for this virtual machine. But again, some people will point out that, well, if vSphere goes down, then Virtual Center goes down. Well, you need to have redundancy. Again, that's the whole point, because Virtual Center isn't the most critical application or server that you have. You're going to have Exchange servers, you're going to have domain controllers, you're going to have file servers, you're going to have a lot of other servers that you want to maintain availability and uptime on. So in that context, if you can't maintain availability for those other applications, well, you obviously aren't doing it for Virtual Center. But if you're able to design your environment properly for all these critical applications, well, then Virtual Center should be considered the same type. Port requirements. Port requirements is particularly interesting and we have to dig into this before we install Virtual Center. And the reason being is a lot of organizations these days are having firewalls within the network. So inside of their LAN, they have firewalls that separates different servers, or firewalls that separates the servers from the desktops, so on and so forth. So it's very important for you to know the port requirements that you need ahead of time, especially if you're a consultant walking into a customer or a client environment, and you need to know which ports need to be open in order for all these different components to communicate properly with one another. So you obviously have port 80 and 443 for web access. You have ports 902 and 903 for the Heartbeat. ESX server and Virtual Center need to communicate, and the way that happens is ESX server will constantly send a heartbeat to Virtual Center, letting it know, hey, I'm still alive, hey, I'm still here. And that's how Virtual Center can also determine if ESX is not online anymore, because it won't receive a heartbeat. Ports 903 is also used by the vSphere client, for example, to display the consoles. So when you open the console of the virtual machine, you need to be able to see that. So if that port is blocked, you won't be able to get to that. You have ports 80, 80, and 84, 43 for web services again. And you have ports 389, 686 for LDAP and SSL, which means for Active Directory and for SSL connectivity, etc., etc. Now, if you needed to change those ports, then obviously the range is from 1025 to 65,535. Let me show you here a graphical representation of the port communication and which component of a Virtual Center or the virtual infrastructure in general needs to communicate with other component. As you can see here, we have the vSphere client that's connected to vCenter, and then you have the ESX host. So this is kind of a graphical representation that gives you an idea of where the ports are and which ones you would need to open. Alright, a few more slides, I promise, and then we're going to get into the installation of a Virtual Center. So licensing. Before we actually install vCenter, we need to know a little bit about licensing. Nobody likes licensing, but unfortunately, it is a necessary evil that we have to understand. Now, with vSphere 4, licensing has been simplified tremendously from the past, from the Virtual Infrastructure 3.5 days. It has been tremendously improved. So you no longer have license files. For those of you that are familiar with the old license files that you had to generate, download, and then there was all these problems and you had to call support for the licensing files, you don't have that anymore. So what they've done is you now have one license per edition, and you have one key for many hosts. So you can have a string of alphanumeric key, and that key will unlock 4 CPUs or 8 CPUs or 12 CPUs, and all these CPUs can be shared among the hosts that you add to your Virtual Center. The other enhancement is you no longer have a license server. You only have these keys, and these keys are loaded inside of Virtual Center, stored in the database, etc. Now, the only time you're going to need a license server, if you're upgrading to vSphere, the only time you'll need a license server is for backward compatibility. So let's say you have 3.5 hosts that you're adding to this Virtual Center environment, then you would need a license server in order to support these legacy hosts. Now, some of the license components that you have with vSphere, you have a product license, a license key, and an asset. So what this means, the product, it's basically, and I'll show you this once we install Virtual Center and we log into it. The product basically allows you to install that product. So product can be ESX, it can be Virtual Center, it can be ESXi, etc., etc. The license key is that alphanumeric string that you install inside of Virtual Center that unlocks these features, that allows you to use these products. And then you have the asset. The asset is the machines where you've installed these licenses on. So that could be ESX, the host that's installed on ESX, that could be the host that you've installed Virtual Center on, so on and so forth. And the reason they need that is sometimes you need to be able to have an asset license because the software that's running on it requires it to have a certain type of hardware or a certain type of virtual machine. You can see this sometimes in the Cisco stuff where you need the voice over IP stuff to be installed on Cisco servers or it won't work, or the virtual machine needs to be installed on a Cisco server or Cisco won't support it, so on and so forth. This can come in handy in that regards. Alright, now let's take a look at how licensing has changed from VI3 to vSphere. So as you can see in this graph here, in the VI3 days, you had about 10 steps in order for you to get licensing to work. With vSphere, that is completely revamped. It's much more simple now. You just basically go on the licensing VMware license portal, you receive a license file, You enter the license key, you assign the key, and boom, you're activated. So it's in 4 steps rather than 10 steps. It's much simpler. You don't have to deal with license files and all the crap that we were dealing with before. Now, enough licensing, and this, I promise, this is the slide before the last before we jump into the installation. Host profiles. Host profiles is a new feature that was introduced with vSphere. It is truly a great feature, and what that does is it helps in standardization. So as virtual environment starts to grow, as you start to add more ESX hosts today and in the future, you need a way to standardize these ESX hosts. Now, you can think of host profiles as a sysprep, kind of like an answer file. It's not exactly an answer file because it doesn't happen during the installation of ESX. It happens after the fact. So what you do with a host profile is you find an ESX host that you like, you configure it to your liking, and you say, I want to model all the next ESX hosts that I add to my farm after this ESX host. So you take an image of its configuration. Now, this is not an image of the whole ESX host, it's just an image of all of its configuration. You make a file of it, and then when you add other ESX hosts to your farm, what you do is you take the host profile off of this ESX host that you liked, and you apply it to the new ESX host. Now, this is also useful in case you're already running an environment and you want to implement host profiles after the fact. That's fine. You can still go to one of the ESX hosts, configure it the way you like, save that profile, and apply that profile to all of the current ESX hosts, and it will make sure they're all standardized. So you won't have any other ESX hosts that have different types of configurations. Now, the only thing I want to mention about host profiles is that it only comes with the Enterprise Plus versions of vSphere. You won't get it if you're just on Enterprise or below. So it's only Enterprise Plus. And the last slide we're going to talk about here is link mode. Link mode is really cool because sometimes you have multiple virtual center servers, and this can happen for a whole slew of reasons. Maybe you just acquired another company, and that company has its own virtual infrastructure, and it's going to take time for you to integrate all these systems. Or maybe you don't want to integrate these systems. You have 2 virtual centers all of a sudden. Or if your company is going on a rampage and they just acquire 2 or 3 virtual centers, the old way of doing things is you would have to log on to each one of these virtual centers and manage it separately. Well, with vSphere, now you have what's known as a link mode. So you can link all of these virtual centers together and manage them as a single entity. Manage all of their hosts. Manage hosts across multiple virtual centers. Manage virtual machines across multiple virtual centers from a single console. So you only log on once and you have access to all of these virtual centers. It can be very, very, very useful. Alright, so now without further ado, let's go ahead and get out of this presentation and log on to a terminal server and install Virtual Center. Alright, now let's go ahead and install Virtual Center. So what I've done here is I've copied the media files onto the desktop into a folder called VC. So we're going to go in here and we're going to run autorun.exe, which is going to bring up the menu of options that we can install. Now the first thing we're going to install is obviously vCenter Server, and then we'll go through some of the other options that are available for us. Now the beauty of Virtual Center Server is it's a framework. It's a pluggable framework that allows third-party components such as vCenter Guided Consolidation and vCenter Update Manager and vCenter Converter to be installed on top of Virtual Center and expand its features and reach. You can also install the vCenter or the vSphere client onto this server or onto your laptop, maybe your desktop, or if you have a dedicated management console that you want to install it on. So the purpose of the vSphere client is to allow you to connect to Virtual Center Server. So let's go ahead and get started with vCenter Server. The installation is very straightforward. It's going to ask you a couple of questions. We've covered all of it through the presentation portion, so unless we want to make changes to the default settings, the installation should be very straightforward, very quick. I'm going to go ahead and click out of this folder here. Alright, we're going to click on Next to kickstart this wizard. Now you can feel free to read through the license agreement. Once you're done, just click on I agree, Next. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to put in the organization name. Now for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to leave the license key blank so that I can use the 60-day evaluation license. But if you have a production license key, feel free to put it in here, or you can leave this blank. Once a Virtual Center comes up, I'll show you where you can go and actually make or install the actual license key. So I'm going to click Next to continue. Now this is where you configure the database connectivity for vCenter. For the purposes of this demonstration again, I'm going to use Microsoft SQL Server 2005 Express instance, which is going to install itself on this vCenter server. Now, because my environment is going to have 2 ESX hosts, 3 at the most, this is a good database to choose. Now, for your environment, and depending on the types of databases or the type of ESX environment you're going to have, I strongly recommend that you use a third-party database. For that matter, you would select the second option. Now, you would have to have a pre-configured ODBC connection. Now, to pre-configure the ODBC connection, you can go to Start, Settings, Control Panel, and you would go into the Administrative Tools, and then click on Data Sources, and configure a system DSN to point to the database server. Once the system DSN is configured and pointing to your database server, it's going to show up in this wizard here, and you'll be able to select it from the drop-down menu. Now, before we move forward, for those of you that are curious, I am installing Virtual Center on a virtual machine here. Again, based on what we covered in the presentation, I think it's the best option. That way it can participate in HA and DRS and all the advanced enterprise features. So I'm going to click on Next to continue here. Now here you can choose to use the system account to run some of the Virtual Center services, or you can uncheck the box and specify a different account. Now this account, as you can see down here from the security advisor, is going to need to be granted the logon as service right. Now there are 2 options of doing this. The system account has way too much security, so for security best practices, you probably want to create a different user account that's dedicated to running these services, that has local administrative rights. That way it's a little less than using the system account. But again, for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to leave this at default, and we're going to click on Next to continue. I'm going to leave it as at default as well for the destination folder. Now here's where you can either create a standalone VMware vCenter server instance, or you can add this vCenter server to a link mode. The object of link mode, like we talked in the presentation, is if you have multiple Virtual Center servers. So sometimes enterprises have more than one Virtual Center server, either spread out geographically or in the same instance, but they just want to keep them separate. But instead of logging on to each instance of Virtual Center and managing it that way, you can use link mode, which allows you to log on to any Virtual Center server that is participating in link mode and manage all the ESX hosts and all the virtual machines across Virtual Center servers. So it just makes management of multiple Virtual Center servers a little easier. So for the purposes again of this demo, we're just going to go with option number 1, which is to create a standalone VMware vCenter server instance. Now for the ports, I'm going to leave everything at default. We covered this in the presentation. Now unless you have anything in particular that you want to manually modify, this is where you would do it. Just make sure that when you're making this modification here, that on your firewall and the communication between the ESX hosts and Virtual Center server, if it's crossing any networks or firewalls, make sure that those ports are open. I'm going to click on Next here, and we're going to go ahead and click on Install. I mean, the install is extremely straightforward. Again, unless you're modifying some of the default settings, then it's very straightforward. Alright, and that's all there is to it. Now the wizard has finished installing vCenter server, so we're going to click on Finish. It's going to prompt us to restart the server. So we're going to restart the server. Alright, now that the server has rebooted, the first thing I want to double check is I want to make sure that all the services, the VMware vCenter services, are there and they're started. So I've launched the services console here, and Virtual Center server is started. All the management services, these are the services that need to be started. Everything is good. Orchestrator, you can start that on demand as you need it. So now that we have vCenter server installed, the second thing that we want to install is the vSphere client in order to gain connectivity to this server in order to be able to manage it. Now, in order to install vSphere client, we're going to go into this VC folder again, and we're going to run autorun again. And this time from the menu, we're going to go ahead and select vSphere client. The installation of the vSphere client is extremely straightforward. So we're just going to accept all the defaults and push forward with the installation. I'm going to click on Next to start the wizard. We're going to accept the license agreement, and we're going to give the company name. Now we're also going to install the host update utility. Now we're going to talk about the host update utility in a lot more detail when we talk about upgrading the environment, upgrading from earlier versions of VMware ESXi 3.5, etc. in that module. But what it does in a nutshell is it allows you to update hosts on the fly. So you can take a 3.5 ESX 3.5 host, you use a graphical user interface to upgrade that to vSphere or ESX4. So we'll talk about that in the upgrade module. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and click that box to install it, and we're going to click on next. I'm going to keep it in the default location, and we're going to go ahead and install. And that's it. We're going to click on finish, and then we're going to double click on this newly added icon here on our desktop that launches the vSphere client, and we're going to log on to vCenter Server. Now, because we're vCenter Server and the vSphere client happen to be on the same box, we can use as IP address or name, we can use localhost. But if the vSphere client was residing on a management station or on your laptop, you'd obviously have to put the IP address or fully qualified domain name of vCenter Server before you can connect. Now, as far as a username and password is concerned, vCenter is part of Active Directory. It plugs into Active Directory. So any user that is a member of the local administrators group on Virtual Center is automatically going to get access to vCenter Server. Now, you can obviously go into that and change the security as you need to, but for the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to keep it as is, and we'll talk about security in greater detail when we cover that in the security module. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to use the administrator account, and I'm going to log in with those credentials. Now we're going to be prompted for an SSL certificate. We have to accept an SSL certificate or ignore it. Now what we have here is a self-signed certificate that the VMware installer created for this instance of Virtual Center. So you have two options here. You can select this checkbox to install the certificate and not display this again, or if you wanted to make this or adhere to security best practices, what you would need to do is, if you have a certificate authority on your domain, you would have to issue an SSL certificate for this instance of vCenter Server, or if you're using a third-party certificate authority like VeriSign, you would buy a certificate and install it on Virtual Center. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to go ahead and select this checkbox here and log on to Virtual Center. This loading inventory makes me feel good because it shows me that everything's okay. I'm actually going to see Virtual Center. When I see loading inventory, I kind of get this good feeling because I know that everything's okay. So we're using an eval version of vCenter, so we're going to get this prompt. We're going to click on OK to exit out of it. And for those of you that are used to ESX 3.0 or 3.5, this is a familiar console, but we're going to go through some of the changes that vSphere 4 has introduced. So for example, if you go click up here on the home, you'll notice that they've redesigned the entire screen to make it easier for you to access the different components and different features of Virtual Center. Now you'll notice here that the Virtual Center welcome screen has been completely revamped. For those of you that are familiar with ESX 3.0 and 3.5, when you first logged on to Virtual Center, you got that annoying welcome screen that you really didn't know what to do with it, the getting started screen. Everybody wanted to close it. And even VMware gave you the option if you wanted to disable that getting started screen. So it wasn't very useful. The home screen here has been completely revamped. It gives you access to some very cool hotkeys, so you can get around the screen very easily by just using some keyboard combinations. So for example, if I wanted to go from the home screen to hosts and clusters, I can hold down the control key and the shift key and click on the letter H, and that will take me to hosts and clusters. From here, if I want to move to the virtual machine and templates, I can do the same thing, control shift and click on the letter V. So these are just easy way to get around the screen. It's the same thing for networks and for data stores. So control shift N takes me to networking, and you'll notice here how networking changed. And if I do control shift D, that's going to update to data stores. Now we haven't created anything yet, so you'll notice on the left in the inventory we can expand it and then drill down through the folders that we've created, and you can see your data stores, etc., etc. Now going back to the home screen, you're not going to use the combination control shift. Here you're going to use the combination alt and the home screen key on your keyboard. So alt home takes you back to the home screen. Now you'll notice that this home screen is broken down into three categories. You have your inventory, and under inventory it gives you the four main object categories, which are the hosts and clusters, the virtual machines and templates, the data stores, and networking. These are the main top level categories. Now obviously you have resource pools and other kinds of objects, but that's the topmost categories. Now you'll notice you also have a feature here is search. Search is great because when you come to search, it's going to search through the entire inventory for every type of object. Now you can narrow that down if you wanted to by clicking on this icon here and just tell it I want to search just within hosts or just within virtual machines or folders, etc. But in general it's going to go through the entire inventory unless you minimize that. Now you'll notice that also on the top right here you have that same search bar that's always present throughout the different screens. So if you ever wanted to search and it doesn't matter which screen you're in, you don't have to come to the search dedicated screen. You can either put in whatever keyword you're looking for or again try to narrow it down by selecting the different category. Now I want to go back to my home screen. Anyone remember how to go back to the home screen? Bueller Alt Home takes you back to the home screen again. Now the second row you'll notice here is administration. So what VMware has done with the home screen is it's made it very easy for you to get access via one click to any one of the different sections to administer your environment. So the administration screen gives you access to the roles, that's the security, we'll talk about that later, the sessions, licensing, etc. And now the third tab, you'll have access to all of the management tools that you have, like the scheduled tasks, the events, the maps, the host profiles, and some of the customization specification. Now the first thing I want to talk about here before we get into any of the details or add any hosts or virtual machines to vCenter is I want to talk about database sizing. So we went ahead and created a SQL or an Oracle database or an instance to host or to capture and collect or to be a central repository for all of the virtual center data and configuration stuff. But how do we size it? How do you know how big it should be or how small it should be? Or how do you take into account the future hosts that you're going to add or how big the virtual machines are going to be, etc., etc. So there's a very cool database sizing tool that comes with Virtual Center that allows you to estimate what the database size should be and gives you a good educated guess on how to configure that. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to click on vCenter Server Settings here, and we're going to click on Statistics. Now in the statistics you'll notice that it's asking you how many physical hosts do you have. So if you had 50 physical hosts running 2,000 virtual machines, then the estimated database space required would be 14.28 gig. Now obviously you can feel free to change that. Let's say we want to do something a little more realistic. Let's do 10 hosts and let's go ahead and do 250 VMs. So at that point you would need, the database size would need to be about 2.1 gig. So this is a very handy utility that you can use to do an educated estimate of how large or how much disk space you would require for your database server. Alright, now let's go into hosts and clusters and talk a little bit about that. So what was that keyboard shortcut again? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? Alright, Control-Shift-H. That brings us to hosts and clusters. So before we go ahead and add any kind of hosts and any VMs and start doing any kind of the cool stuff, let's talk about organization a little bit. So we're given a couple of different ways to organize our virtual machines. Now, because this is a virtual infrastructure, it has the tendency to grow. You're going to have hundreds, thousands of virtual machines maybe, and you need to be able to organize those. And organization comes handy because you need to be able to give users or administrators or business owners or application owners access to Virtual Center. But the way you should give them access is role-based access. So every user should be able to log into vCenter and only get access and see the applications or the servers that he or she are responsible for. And the only way that you're going to be able to give them that role-based access is if you organize your inventory accordingly in order to be able to sustain that security infrastructure that you're trying to put in place. But before we even go into that, how do you organize your hosts? Especially if your organization spreads across multiple geographical locations. If you have ESX hosts, maybe in multiple geographical locations. How do you organize all of that? The best way to organize the inventory is based on geographic location. Now you're given the option of creating folders, and folders are great in order to separate the different geographical locations and then create data centers underneath. Now, a data center is the minimum requirement, it's the building block that you need to create in order to add hosts. But before we do that, let's go ahead and divide our organization based on geographic location. So if you had offices in Chicago and in Las Vegas and in Europe, the first thing you would want to do is create folders for every one of those continents, or for every one of those countries. For example, you can, if the organization is big enough, you can divide it into the Americas, Europe, Asia, Australia, etc. But to keep it simple, what we're going to do here is we're going to right click and we're going to go ahead and create a folder, and we're going to name it Chicago, and we're going to create another one, and let's name it, for giggles, Las Vegas. Feeling lucky today. So once we've created those folders, now we can create data centers under those folders. Now the idea here is you can have multiple data centers in Chicago or multiple data centers in Las Vegas. In my case, my company has more than one data center located in Chicago. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to right click on Chicago, and now I'm going to create a data center. The first data center that I'm going to create, I'm going to name Michigan. And then the second data center that we're going to create in Chicago, we're going to name Wacker. So now under both of these data centers, I have ESX hosts. So now if I come to the Michigan data center, I right click on that. Now I have the ability to add a host. You can add a cluster, or you can add more folders. Now you can add subfolders if you wanted to in order to get more organized. The only thing I'm going to caution is folders and organization in general is meant to make your life easy, not hard. Don't organize them to the point where you can't find your stuff anymore. Don't overdo it. Just organize them enough where it's easier, it's one or two click away for you to get to any of the hosts or any of the virtual machines that you're trying to access. Over organizing tends to backfire on you, and then it gets complicated, and you want to try to stay away from that, shy away from that as much as possible. So now that we've created our folders the way we wanted to, now we can slap security on them. Now you can right click on the Chicago folder and add security, add permissions on it. You can even do that on a data center. You can do that on the host level. You can do that on the VM level. It's very object oriented, so you can get very granular with the type of security. Now we're going to cover security in the security model in a lot more detail, but I want to give you just a general overview of what you can do here, or what you can expect. Now what I've done under the Michigan data center here for my configuration is I've created folders that I want to group my different virtual machines in once I add them. So once I have a virtual machine that's a database server, I'm going to put it on the database servers. Print server, under print server, terminal server, on the terminal server, web server, etc., etc. Now you can do this via the function of the server, so via file server, print server, etc. Or you can do this via application. So if you have an application in your environment that requires a web server, a file server, a print server, a SQL server, and a terminal server, you can create whatever that application's name might be, JD Edwards, Dyna, whatever the application name might be. You'll create a folder under that application, and then you'll add all the relevant servers that make up this application under that. You can group them that way. That makes sense. Depending again on how your organization is structured, if you're doing role-based access based on the application, if your enterprise is structured in such a way where there's a group that handles this application and all of its servers and all of its components, then it's a good idea to create a folder for that application, put all the servers in there, give access and permissions based on that. But if your organization is the systems group is going to handle all the systems regardless of what application they're based on, then maybe you want to create a systems folder, or maybe you want to break them down with file servers, print servers, Unix servers, Windows servers, etc. However way it makes sense to you. Alright, now let's go ahead and add some ESX hosts. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add two hosts. I'm going to add ESX01 which is still ESX 3.5. I'm going to leave that in there for the later module when we talk about the different ways you can update and upgrade to ESX 4. So I'm going to add that to the inventory to show you backward compatibility, and then we're going to add ESX02, which is an ESX 4 host, to this inventory. So I'm going to add both of them to the Michigan data center. So I'm going to right click and we're going to drag down to add host. Now, for the add host, you can add it either via fully qualified domain name or you can add it via its IP address. Obviously, adding it via fully qualified domain name is better in terms of searching, pinging, whatever, but it also helps because when it comes time to configure vMotion is going to heavily require the fully qualified domain name before that function completes. So it's one of the prerequisites. So let's go ahead and add ESX01, which again is an ESX 3.5 environment. So we're going to click on next here. Basically, it's saying that it doesn't have the authenticity. What we're going to do is we're going to allow it to create one, and we're going to allow it to add everything under that inventory. So if there's any virtual machines, if there's any resource pools, etc., it's just going to grab everything from that host and add it back to Virtual Center. So I'm going to click on next. We're going to add it in the Michigan data center and finish. And while that's adding, what we're going to do is we're going to right click on Michigan again, and we're going to drag down to add host, and now we're going to add the ESX4 host, which is ESX02.eliaskanister.com. The username is root, and notice here that we're adding a username that has access to the ESX host itself. So you're giving Virtual Center permission to control that ESX host, so you have to give it a username and password that can control that host. In this case, what we have configured on our ESX host is the root. So we're going to click on next, and again we're going to click yes to the security alert. We're going to accept the inventory and the resource pools, everything that's on that ESX host, and then you'll notice here that it's prompting us for a license key in order to add this ESX host. Now, you can always do the eval license if you're still evaluating this, or you can add a license. Now, if you're trying to add a license, you're going to click on the second option here, which is assign a new license key to this host, and you're going to enter that key. So, for the purposes of this example, I'm going to enter a key, but you guys are going to notice that it's grayed out. And I'm going to gray this out throughout the video because this is kind of a production license key, so we're going to gray it out, but it's just a bunch of numbers and letters. We're going to click on next to move forward. Then again, it's in the Michigan data center, and finish. Now it'll take a second here before it initializes the host and adds them to the inventory. And voila. If we expand this a little bit here so we can see better, you'll notice that ESX01 is still version 3.5, and then you have ESX02, which is ESX4. Now, one thing to talk about here that's kind of interesting about data centers and folders and all that stuff is once you've created your virtual machines and you've organized them under your data centers, you'll be able to migrate, or let's say you'll be able to vMotion virtual machines that are in the same data center. So if you, in my case, I have ESX01 and ESX02 in the Michigan data center. I can vMotion all day between those hosts. Any virtual machine that resides on any of those hosts can be vMotion from ESX01 to ESX02 all day. However, if I have, for example, ESX03 in the Las Vegas Boulevard data center, I won't be able to do vMotions from the Michigan data center over to the Las Vegas data center. But I will be able to do other functions such as cloning, for example. So not all functions are available for you to do between data centers. Data centers are typically made so that they isolate a particular environment, and as such, not all features will function across data centers. This is important, and you need to keep that in mind while you're building and organizing your hierarchy. Now, you noticed here when we added our ESX host to Virtual Center, what happens is during this process is the agent is installed on the actual ESX host which it should be running at that point in order for ESX host to communicate with Virtual Center. Now, in the event that you're having an issue where you're unable to add your ESX host to Virtual Center, and you double check that your IP address is correct, you're using the correct IP address, or your IP address is resolving properly to the fully qualified domain name that you're trying to add, you're using the correct username and password for the root username and password for this ESX host, and it's still not working, then there might be something wrong with the agent on the ESX host. Either the agent is not running, or the agent wasn't properly installed. One or the other. You can do your research, but one of the first things that you want to do is you want to make sure that the VMware-hostd service is running within the ESX host in order for that host to make a proper or correct connection and a successful connection to Virtual Center. Now, the way to start or restart, for example, the VMware-hostd service is you can SSH or do a remote console to your server, and then from there just do service space management, and that's written mgmt-vmware space start to restart the VMware-hostd service within the service console. Okay, one thing to note here is now that we've added both ESX01 and ESX02 to Virtual Center, what you want to try to avoid doing is never log in to the host directly. So never do this, for example. Let's just minimize Virtual Center, launch the vSphere client again, and try to do esx01.eliaskinaser.com, and you'll notice that I'm logging in, or I'm trying to log in using the root username and password. So once you try to log in here, it's going to give you an error message or a warning immediately saying this host is being managed by Virtual Center and you should not be logging into it because it could cause potential corruption or damage to the database. Whoops. Now, we got this error, and this is kind of interesting. I didn't even plan on doing this, but since it came up. So we've installed the vSphere client, and the vSphere client is intended to manage ESX4 and above hosts. Now, because I've added ESX 3.5 to my inventory, and I'm trying to give the example of how to log into an ESX 3.5 host, it's basically saying that you're using a newer version of the client, and it's trying to install the virtual infrastructure client, which was dedicated or which is intended for use with 3.5 clients or earlier. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to click cancel because we want to demonstrate, or I need to prove a point with the logging on directly to the host. So I'm going to try to log on to ESX02 just to show you the warning message that you're going to see, basically saying you should not be logging on directly to a host that's being managed by Virtual Center. Any second now. And there it is. So it basically gives you that warning, so you should not be logging on to the host directly when it's being managed by Virtual Center. So we're going to click OK here, and we're going to actually exit out without doing any sorts of task. Now, this is not to say that prior to adding an ESX host to Virtual Center, you can't log on to it via the vSphere client or the virtual infrastructure client if it's an older version of ESX. You absolutely can. That's actually the only way you can manage ESXi, is to log on through a GUI interface, aside from the fact that you can log on directly to the console. Let's go back into Virtual Center here, and we want to go back to the home screen in order to start looking at other features. So how do we do that again? Yeah, we click on Alt Home, and we've covered almost everything on the first row as far as how to navigate and what everything does. Now, don't worry about networking, data stores, and virtual machines and templates. As we start to talk about networking in the networking module and storage in the data stores in the storage module, etc., virtual machines and the virtual machine module, will cover that in greater detail. But Virtual Center in general is a management and administration entity. It's a tool that allows you to manage and centrally administer your hosts and virtual machines. So I want to focus on the aspects of Virtual Center that are relevant to you in this module. So if we look at the second row here, which is administration, we have several different options, and let's go through each one of them. So roles, allows you to create a specific role for users that are logging on to Virtual Center. A role allows you to say, I want so and so user when they log on to get this view and this right. I want them to be able to manage host A, ESXi, for example, but not ESXi. I want them to be able to manage this virtual machine and that virtual machine. So you can get very, very granular with the type of role-based access that you can configure to Virtual Center. Now, Virtual Center gives you a pre-configured set of roles. So, for example, if you add no access, that user can't access, that particular user won't be able to access anything in Virtual Center. This can be handy. I mean, it kind of looks silly up there because you could say, well, I won't just give them access. Well, this is just in case you want to target certain groups or certain users that might be part of other groups. So you can give your domain admins, for example, access. So what you can do here is you can give no access to a particular user in the domain admins, for example. Read-only allows you to give users read-only access to Virtual Center or to certain objects and inventories, etc., etc. Now, if you notice that there's a role here that doesn't meet your specific requirements and you wanted to add your own role, you can always right-click anywhere, pretty much. You can right-click up here, click on Add, and you can create your own role. You can name this role VM admins, and you can drill down the list here as far as alarms, data center, etc., and specify the permissions that this particular role has access to. So, for example, you can drill down into data centers and give this user the ability to create a data center, etc., etc., and you can click on OK, and you've created this role. Now, once you've created a role, that allows you to add users and then tell these or specify which role you want to assign to these users. Now, I'm not going to dig very deep into roles and how it works in this module. We're going to leave that to the security module because we'll go through the steps here. Now, moving on to another tab, there's obviously a couple different options we can do this. We can do Control or Alt Home and go back to the home screen and start over from there. Or you'll notice up on the navigation screen here you have a logical configuration of where you're at. So, for example, now we're in the roles tab, I can call it, and we're looking at this particular Virtual Center server. So if I wanted to go one step backwards, or if I wanted to stay within administration and see what else I can configure, we can click on the administration here and drag down to administration. You'll notice roles, and you'll notice the second option was sessions. So if we click on sessions, sessions is really cool and very handy. So as you start growing Virtual Center role-based access, all these different users are going to start logging on to Virtual Center in order to complete a certain task, or if they're administering virtual machines or data centers, or if you have a global deployment of Virtual Center with multiple instances, then you want to see who's logged on. And this is helpful, first of all, because a lot of times you're going to notice that people are idle for 10, 12 hours or days, and you want to terminate their session, free up some resources, etc. But the other cool thing that you can do here is if you're trying to bring down Virtual Center for a reboot or for whatever the case might be, you can interact with these users. You can right-click on the user and send a message to them, for example. Unfortunately, in this example, I'm the only one logged in, so I can't interact with a user, but you can always right-click on a particular session and interact with it. The other useful thing that you can do here is you can set a message of the day. So, for example, you know that tomorrow afternoon you have an outage, or there's an outage scheduled. You can always put a message of the day so that users know that, okay, there's something going on with Virtual Center or in the environment in general at a given time. So that can be useful. Obviously, you have the active sessions count here, and you also have the idle sessions count. So idle sessions, or sessions in general, can be very handy when you're trying to find out who's logged on to the environment and what they're doing, and trying to notify people of events that are going to happen. So now we want to go back to the home screen. I'm just going to go back to the home screen just to show you guys that we're going in sequential as far as the administration tab is concerned. So I'm going to do Alt Home again, and you notice we started with roles, we moved on to sessions, and now we can go to licensing. Licensing is where all licensing happened. We covered that during the presentation portion of this module, so I'm not going to talk a lot about it. We covered all of the requirements, etc., but I just wanted to show you where you can find licensing. Now you can obviously report on licensing by product, by license key, or by the actual asset, and you can drill down into these here. Now you'll notice that some of this is grayed out again for security purposes. And I'm going to click on home to go back to the home screen again. So again, you can do Alt Home or you can click on it, whatever's easier for you. And now we're going to click on or go into system logs. System logs are extremely handy. They're particularly handy if you ever need to call VMware support. VMware support, the first thing they're going to ask you when they're trying to troubleshoot a problem is, hey, I need a copy of your logs. Now, you can export the system logs very easily here by clicking on export, giving it a name, and you can drill down with what you want to export. What type of logs are you trying to export here? You can export everything, obviously. You can export the ESX host particular logs by selecting that and give it a name, give it a location, etc. Save it, and then you can take that file and send it to VMware support. But if you're trying to drill down these logs yourself, from the drop-down menu here, you have several logs that you can drill in and try to figure out what's going on in your environment. You have the vCenter server log here, which is the VPXD logs. And the cool thing here is you can use the search string. So if there was anything in particular that you're trying to search for in these logs that caught your attention or that you're trying to find, you don't have to scroll through all this text in order to find it. You can just type it into the search and boom, it's going to go to that particular keyword that you've specified. Going back to the home screen, we can then go into vCenter server settings. These are some of the advanced settings that you can configure for Virtual Center. All of these tabs are very relevant, and you can change ports here. You have the statistics for the database sizing. You have logging operations. But what I wanted to pull your attention to here is mail. So if you wanted your events or your alarms to send you a notification when something happens, then you would want to come in here, put in the SMTP server, put in the sender's account so that it knows where to send it to. The other thing is SNMP if you wanted to create a local string in order to gather performance metrics off of your Virtual Center server. You can configure that with traps, etc. Now the other thing here that can come in handy when you're administering vCenter is the vCenter service status. If the services aren't started for whatever reason, then you won't be able to access a Virtual Center in general. So this is kind of useless at this point. But the other thing is if you're able to access Virtual Center but you wanted to see the status of the other services that are running that are specific to Virtual Center, then this gives you a global view of the Virtual Center server services status. Now let's go back to the home screen here and focus our attention on the management aspects of vCenter. So you have scheduled tasks. Scheduled tasks within Virtual Center are the same like the ones you see in Windows. That serves the same function and purpose. A scheduled task is an event that you create today and that you expect to happen or perform in the future. So these are tasks that are either recurring tasks that happen on a daily or a monthly or an hourly basis that you don't want to have to manually do every time you want to do it, or it's a task that you want to do in the future. You want to bring down an ESX host at 2 o'clock in the morning, but you don't want to be in the office or working from home when that task happens. So you schedule it to happen at a particular time, or you have an outage during an outage window and you're trying to set your scheduled task during that outage window, but you don't want to be physically present or do it manually. Now you can right click here and create on new scheduled task, and it'll give you the option of creating or setting up any number of scheduled tasks that are pre-populated by default for you here. So let's say you wanted to deploy a virtual machine. Let's click on OK. And it gives you the option of configuring what you want to do with this virtual machine. Where do you want to deploy this virtual machine first of all? So you can use this wizard. You can leverage this wizard to deploy virtual machines. So I'm going to exit out of here. We're not actually going to go through a scheduled task, but this gives you a good idea of how you can harness the power of scheduled tasks within Virtual Center to do different tasks that you want to automate or that happen or recur on a consistent basis in your environment. So from within management, again, we're just going to click on management here to see the different options that we have. And we're going to move or focus our attention on events. So events is the culmination or is the result of a task. Every time you do something, in Virtual Center that triggers an event. Whether that event is just an informational event that you did this, or a user did this. This gives you a good history of what happened in Virtual Center. You can always come back here and browse through the events log to see who did what happened here, and it can break it down for you with users, so you'll know which user did what. Now, some of the cool things here with the search feature is you can search for a particular event. If you're trying to target something that happened with a particular host or a particular virtual machine, you can always come up here, put in the name of that virtual machine or the name of that host, and narrow down the events that happened to that particular host. So it's an extremely handy tool, and this keeps everybody honest as well, because it keeps a log of everything that happened. So if somebody said, I didn't do this, and you come into the log and you found that event and you notice that his name is next to it, then he or she can't say that we didn't do this anymore, because you see it. It's very obvious within the events. Now, while we're on the subject of events, another way to view events is to go to a particular object and look at the events for that particular object instead of looking at all the events that happen. So if we go back to the home screen by clicking on Alt Home, and we go into the hosts and clusters inventory, you can click on the Chicago folder, for example, and you're looking at all the tasks and events that happen within the Chicago folder. Now you can drill down a little deeper in case you have multiple data centers and you don't want to look at everything that's happening in Chicago. You want to look at Michigan. So we click on Michigan, and you can also go do tasks and events here. Now you'll be able to also separate tasks from events, so you have two tabs that you can switch back and forth, so you can see your tasks or you can see your events. And this tab exists for every object within Virtual Center, that whether it's resource pools, hosts, clusters, virtual machines, data stores, whatever the case might be, you'll be able to drill down and look at the tasks and events that happened. Now, another very useful tool per se that you can use for troubleshooting in general, or if you're trying to do specific things or you're trying to find specific things within the virtual infrastructure, is the Maps tool or the Maps utility. So if I click up here on Inventory and scroll down to Management, the next thing we want to talk about after Events is Maps. Maps is really cool, because what it does is in one click it will map out your entire environment, so you'll be able to see what's connected to what, and in many cases that is an extremely helpful tool in troubleshooting. So for example, I don't have anything right now, but let's say we wanted to take a look at everything that's happening within Virtual Center. So by checking the checkbox up here on the left, I get everything mapped out to me, and you can add what you see or decrease what you see if it's a little cumbersome, or there's a lot of things going on, by selecting or deselecting checkboxes on the right here. So right now we have host to VM, so we're able to see every host and how it's connected to a virtual machine. We're also able to see if there's fault tolerance relationships, VM to network, so every VM how it's connected to the network. We're able to configure our maps in order to give us better visibility into our environment. This can come in handy if you're trying to shoot vMotion, for example, and vMotion is not working. You can come here and do a host to network view or a virtual machine to network view and take a look at where the issue or the pain point might be. So we know that vMotion requires proper networking configuration, proper storage configuration that happens, and you seem to be missing a step. You can always come here and do, for example, host to data store, and you can do host to network and try to figure out if your network is properly configured or if your data store and storage is properly configured. So again, based on the criteria that you select on the right here, it's going to display a particular map that allows you to be able to better troubleshoot or get better visibility into your environment. Another useful task here is sometimes you're trying to delete a data store, and no matter what you do, where you look, you can't seem to delete that data store because it is still attached to a host, and you can't seem to find it, and you have a bunch of hosts. So what you could do here is very easily you can come in and select host to data store, click apply, and it's going to map out the different hosts to data store connection. Now we can create, we can change the view a little bit to just give you a very focused view, and there it is. Now obviously our environment is small, but if you're in your environment, you have multiple hosts, multiple data stores, this can lay everything out for you and show you where some pain points might be occurring. And from maps, let's move on to host profiles. Host profiles are really cool, and we talked about we talked about them a lot in the presentation. So what host profiles allows you to do is, instead of having to configure an ESX host every time you add it to your farm, or instead of having to worry about whether or not all of your ESX hosts are standardized, are the same configuration, you can create a host profile. A host profile, think about it as a gold image. You use a gold image to deploy to multiple desktops or virtual machines in order to have them all standardized on the same image. Well, host profile is the same thing. So what you do with a host profile is you configure one ESX host that you like, and then you take an image of that ESX host from a configuration standpoint, not from actually imaging the whole thing. Once you have a profile image of it, of how it's configured, then you could take that profile and apply it to other ESX hosts in the farm, and if there are any changes, it will change that ESX host where this host profile is being applied to comply with your host profile. Now, host profile, you can come in here and create a host profile. I'm going to leave that for another module, but you can create the host profile here. You can go through, either import a profile if you have one already created, or you can create a host profile from the existing host. So you can click on next, for example, and you can select which host you want to create the profile from. So we can select the ESXi02, for example, and go through the motions of creating our first host profile from that. And the last thing I want to talk about within the management tab here is, if you click on management, back down to management, and we create on customization specification manager. So what this does is this allows you to create the equivalent of sysprep, whether you're doing that for Windows or you're doing that for Linux. So you create an answer file for these VMs. So instead of having to go through the installation every time you want to install a fresh copy of Windows or Linux and go through and answer all these prompts, you have a pre-configured answer file that you can point your virtual machine to, that populates it accordingly. So when you're cloning a VM, and we'll get into that again when we talk about virtual machines. So I don't want to go into a lot of details. I just wanted to cover that since it shows up on the screen. So you can always come in, right click, click on new, select what type of configuration or answer file we're trying to create for, Windows or Linux, and you can give it a name. For now, I'm just going to do Eli, just to show you this, for the password or for the computer name and organization. Let's just do this and next, and so on and so forth. It's going to prompt you for a product key. Basically, all the steps that you would need, or that Windows would have prompted you for during the installation, you get prompted for during this wizard. Now let's go back to the home screen here. Now, the last thing I want to cover before we wrap up this module is access to Virtual Center. Now, you need to take some things into consideration. The first thing that happens after you install Virtual Center by default is it's going to add the administrator and give it full access over Virtual Center. So the first thing you want to do is create a role-based access for the real Virtual Center administrator. Now, the way to do that is we are going to actually go to hosts and clusters here, and at the top of the inventory, you'll notice the root is the Virtual Center server. So you can always select that Virtual Center server, and on the right here, you're going to click on permissions. When you click on permissions, you're going to notice that it automatically added to the administrator's role. It added the administrator user. So if you click on administrators here, you'll notice that the role is administrator. You can obviously change that, but you don't want to, so we're going to click on cancel. So in order for us to give Virtual Center more customized and more role-based access that's more specific and targeted, you can right click anywhere, click on add permission, and then you select the role over here on the right, what type of role you're trying to give. You want to give administrator role, for example, and you go over here and add the user that you want to give Virtual Center access to. So the first thing you want to do, obviously, is again take out the local administrator if you don't want that local administrator, or if the local administrator is shared among more than just the Virtual Center administrator in your organization, which is typically the case. Typically, the VMware administrator or the virtual infrastructure administrator is a very specific role, and then you have other users that are using the local administrator, and typically the local administrator username and password is the same across multiple Windows servers in the environment, which is another reason why you would want to lock it down a little further. Now, before we wrap up this module, I want to go back into the Roles tab here and show you something else. So if we click on Administration and go to Roles, something really cool here is if you select the No Access role, it's going to show you that this role is currently not in use. If you select the read-only role, for example, it's also going to tell you it's not in use. But if you select Administrator, it's going to list the different users or the different groups that have access to Virtual Center as an administrator. So this gives you an easy way of auditing which users have access to what. So if you're doing a once a year audit of the users that have, or users or different groups in your organization that have access to different roles within Virtual Center, this would be very handy here, but it gives you a quick snapshot of who has access to what. Let's go back to the home screen. With that said, folks, this brings us to the end of the Virtual Center Server module. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.